All right, here we go. Hi, folks, this is Kevin. Welcome to the very first episode and very first season of a brand new podcast I'm putting together. This is called Bear Script. This is going to be a oral commentary of me just kind of talking through the scriptures in a manner that connects a lot of the dots, shows some of the backstory of the text, and it's really the fruit of some previous readings and studies that I especially like to do in my mornings. In the evenings, often this is one of my hobbies, is I'll raise up the garage door and I'll bust out a cigar, I'll pull out my readings, investigate a little bit deeper or talk through them. I've got my wife's homemade kombucha here. This is an enjoyable time for me. And this, in fact, this is a setting that is much like many evenings that I've shared with some young men and fellow ministry colleagues where we would sit down on a lanai in Hawaii and we would go through stogies and we would talk about each other's lives or go through some theological discussions. Very enjoyable time. So this is in one case it's a fruit of earlier studies and readings and we kind of talking more through it in depth. But at another level, it is me reaching out to folks who I no longer live near or have direct contact with. Through the years, some of those that I've discipled or mentored, developed, or even just walked alongside have said, hey, if you ever did something like this on a podcast or a recording, I'd love to plug in. So this is me kind of putting it online and available, a record where friends far away can plug in and enjoy another moment like we've had before. Maybe we'll make some other friends along the way too, people who want to kind of walk through the scriptures in a thoughtful, very in-depth, studious sort of way and approach the scriptures maybe differently than they ever have before. So we'll see who all comes on board. In another sense, this is prep work for a more polished version. I'm not going to polish this up. This is going to be kind of bearishly done. But this is prep work for a more refined set of curriculum that will be produced that folks can tap into in live group forums and studies together that will develop their scriptural literacy. And of course, in those forums, we won't have cigars and be drinking kombucha together. They will have a written form and a guide with leaders taking them through it. So this is sort of three things, right? It's me talking this through previous studies. It's connecting with folks who can plug into this record. And three, it's prep work for a more refined and polished sort of product. Well, what I'm going to be doing in the season one is going through the writings of two authors that pretty much dominate as far as volume the text of the New Testament. And those two fellows are the Apostle Paul, of course, and also the doctor and the writer Luke. But we're going to put their writings together as a mashup, and there's a reason why I'm going to do that in this season, in this series. But before I go into that intro on Luke and Paul and the way that they write and how we're going to fit all the pieces together in the series, that's all very interesting. There's some good content to it. But since the text is so important, I thought I'm going to just jump right in and read the content of this first episode, the material that this first episode is going to capture. And that's going to be just 4 verses to start off, because this is an intro episode in many ways. And it's going to be Luke chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. So just 4 verses. And since it's so short, I'll read all 4 verses here, and I obviously won't do that in the other episodes. So I'm just going to read it and let some of the material sit in the back of our mind while I then leave it and go into some interesting introductory material. Okay, so this is Luke chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Luke writes, "Since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Those are the first 4 verses that we're going to start off with. And I'm not going to go into much explanation on that right now, but we will break down these things in a little bit. And maybe you'll even enjoy a stogie cigar with me. By the way, if you're listening to this on just an audio like a Spotify account, I'm going to put this also on something that carries video. YouTube is a likely answer for that. And so if you just have the audio and you want to tune in to kind of the ambiance of what we're doing here, then I will also be able to put up some graphics on the screen that kind of talk through a little bit of the outline of the course of my reasoning, during the episode. But you can see right off the bat, these first 4 verses is Luke saying, hey, I'm writing to some guy named Theophilus, and other people have put together an account of the things we saw and were a part of. And I decided it was also time for me to write something out also. And so I did a lot of investigation, and so I'm presenting this account to you. And we'll go into that in more detail. But let me just back up a little bit and say something more about Bear Script. One of the things I want to do as we go through each one of these texts in each one of these episodes is to start to string together a backstory that can be put together by reading lots of little details and in-betweens and nuances that are provided in the text, to reconstruct a backstory of what's going on when this stuff is written. A lot of folks open up the scriptures and they've been told to expect certain things, like this is a book from beginning to end that is basically just a love letter to you from God. And, I find pieces, like that in here, but I certainly don't see it like that from beginning to end. I think it's much more complicated. People will say, just read the scriptures for yourselves. It speaks for itself. And, I'm just going to give folks permission who don't see that it always just speaks for itself to say, no, some of this doesn't make sense, and I don't know how. There's a lot of different books here, and they seem to change the literary form and the way they're talking, and they don't talk in the way I would talk. I'm a big believer that Scripture must be interpreted, and I think it's helpful to go through a guide and to learn how to approach the Scriptures and to get yourself into the socioeconomic, political, historical mindset of the first original audience. And I think it's also important for us to look at how the different writers, when you go from book to book, they have I would call it an apostolic decision, literary decision that they make. In other words, these are many times apostle-sized figures. They move communities. They multiply and build and expand and make multiplicative the work of building churches and have large strategic effects of spreading the gospel. And so when they write, they don't just relay content. They write with a style and an attitude, a spunk, a mood, sometimes very straightforward and logical, and they just give a chronicle of stuff. But a lot of times they write in a way to instigate, not just to relay content, but to instigate you as you're reading it to certain moods and feelings, or even, to have attention to detail. I think that's the way Jesus spoke a lot of times. His parables were very instigative. And so there's a literary form that the writer uses when they write these words down. And Luke does it one way and Paul does it a different way. And as we kind of talk through all that stuff, then we're able to especially understand what's being written if we have a backstory that provides a line of continuity. So we can step into the world of that first audience. What were they thinking? What were they feeling? And then we're able to see that the writer wrote in a certain way to move them. And then we're able to go, oh, okay, now let me open up to some of these stories and some of this theological writing and see if it makes more sense. And that's part of what my oral commentary will be about too, is opening up those two things. What's the mindset of the first audience? What are the literary decisions of the writer? But then how do we put it together with actual text to see what's going on and how it all strings together in a meaningful sort of way? And so one of my goals is to illuminate that backstory in that sense of, okay, what are they saying? And secondly, and it sort of is a second order effect from this, because I really enjoy identifying the unique people building designs or the God's community building designs that are revealed in the scriptures. I think that we live in a time and age where the Christianity of many of our cultures doesn't know how to build a people. And I think that's a big question. I think that's a big question mark that people have out there about whether they're going to go back to the church or not, or they're going to give Christianity a try. I think there's a big question mark on the faith of Christianity, and it goes like this. Does this message, does this people have the capacity to build a people, to build a faith community? People are starving for community. I think it's a lost art, and I think that these pages are loaded with insights of God's people building designs. And a lot of times that crosses lines and connects different segments of populations that are different from one another. People have a variety of cultures, backgrounds, experiences, ethnicities, traditions and styles, ways of doing things, different socioeconomic classes. And many folks will charge that people building and community building is something that our faith needs to learn. This is loaded in here. And so the two things that I especially like to do in going through these things, I'm repeating myself, but I think that these things are important, is number one, let's illuminate the backstory so it can create meaning with the text. And number two is let's identify and pinpoint people building, community building designs along the way. Good kombucha. Good stuff. Especially the homemade stuff it's made with. It's good for the gut. Probiotics. Okay, so why Luke and Paul? Why would we put these two guys together? So first of all, Luke and Paul are the two most prolific writers of the New Testament. And if you put their writings together, they make up half of the entire New Testament. And if you can sync them, should you sync them? That's a question. If you can sync them, create a mashup between them that holds the integrity, how about expands the integrity of the understanding of what they were real and the intent of what they were writing, then, well, let's go for it. Luke, for example, writes 2 books in the New Testament. He writes a gospel. It's called Luke. And Luke is the longest book in the entire New Testament. Luke also writes the second longest book in the New Testament, and it's a sequel to Luke. Not a lot of folks know right off the bat that Luke has a sequel to this. So this is an account of the life of Jesus, Luke is, and then comes the book of Acts. And so he writes that. That's where Jesus has just ascended into heaven, and now he empowers with the Holy Spirit his band of apostles and disciples. And it's the story about them really growing as a church and then venturing out on missionary voyages to share the gospel towards the ends of the earth. So he writes Luke and Acts, the 2 longest books in the New Testament. So by the time we read the contents of Luke, well, we have read more than we will ever read of the writings of guys like Peter, John, James, and such. Now, Paul, on the other hand, his books are a lot shorter than Luke, but he writes the largest number of books in the New Testament, depending how you count them, because there's one book in question. It's the book of Hebrews. Did Paul write that one or not? But he wrote lots of letters in the New Testament. But they have a couple of connections that are interesting, and this is why we would put them together in a mashup of a series between Luke and Paul. We would want to put Luke and Paul in a mashup series. I think we should do it this way. And there's two things that stand out to me when I think, okay, well, Kevin, how are you going to put Luke and Acts, together, their writings as a mashup? Number one is that Luke is a traveling companion with Paul. They have close contact for the bulk of Paul's missionary journeys. There are 3 New Testament letters that Paul writes where he's referencing Luke also. And it's in those letters, and they're very short references, but it's in those letters that we kind of start to unpack what Luke was like or who he was, and then we can see a lot of affirmation of those things by reading Luke himself. And so Luke is, in one sense, he's a traveling companion with Paul, but he's also a fellow workman with Paul. And there's a debate out there about, are there other apostles besides the 12 apostles, minus the one and then plus the one, and then also plus Paul. There's mention of, and Paul especially mentions, the other apostles. And when he talks like that, Luke is really close to the context. And so Luke may have been considered a sub-apostle or even apostle, depending on where you're on the debate. He was a real workman. He was a significant figure. He was entrusted, and we'll see that later on, he was entrusted sometimes where Paul had planted a church where Christianity and the gospel had not been known before. It was time for Paul to move on. He leaves Luke behind, and along with other leaders, to shore up the teachings and the trainings of the church and appoint elders and to establish the foundational understandings of what they should be about and what they should think as a brand new Church of Christ. So Luke was involved very intimately with the ministry of Paul. So Paul knew Luke and Luke knew Paul. And a lot of their stories then are related as far as their eyewitness accounts, especially on the journeys of Paul. But another big factor that I would say about how we would use these two in a mashup is that they're completely different kinds of guys, and at least in their writing styles, and it makes me think their thinking process too. Their writing styles are very differentiated from one another, and that can serve a good purpose, because one will give us a very sequential, orderly account of things, and then the other one will present these tangents and theological depths and musings and bringing in thinking models for the recipients of his letters to ponder and think about. And it can actually be exasperating to read Paul sometimes. There's a reference in one of the books that the Apostle Peter writes, and he actually says, Paul writes difficult things that are so hard to understand sometimes. So in the New Testament, one of the apostles, Peter, talks about Paul writing his letters, and he calls Paul's letters scripture. And so the apostles knew that they were writing scripture. But Peter talks about Paul's stuff is really hard to understand sometimes. And many of you have read letters of Paul, and you just thought, where are you going, with this? Because sometimes I picture it like you might go to a circus, and there's that guy that spins all the different plates at different times, on a stick. But I see Paul begins talking about this encouraging thing, and then he introduces a topic, and he gives some real depth and thinking to the topic, and it's like he got this plate spinning, and you're like, okay, Paul is talking about this. But then it doesn't take too long before he goes over here, and he gets another plate on a stick, and he starts spinning that. And it's like, he just I think he just went on a tangent here. He's probably going to bring that back around and make sense of this per this. But all of a sudden now he's got another plate, and it doesn't take long before Paul is spinning several different plates, and you're like, wait, what are you doing? And if you read his stuff many times, you got to read his stuff several times, understand what the purpose of the book or the letter is, or what it was supposed to do for the people. And sometimes you feel like, I don't know exactly what he was, bottom line trying to tell them, but he's got all these plates spinning, and you wonder, is he going to bring this stuff around? And sometimes you read one of his letters and you don't know if he really did bring it around. If you study it more and more and more, then you start to be able to identify the geniusness of Paul. And I think sometimes he's explaining things so that people will understand stuff. And other times I think he is depositing a cycle or a system of thought that is entrusted then to the sovereign minds of leaders who are in a church. And they're going to wrestle through what Paul said and use it more as a sampling, like, well, he said this, and I'm going to grab that, and he's sampling a larger idea with this explanation of details and deep thinking. And I'm going to reach into that, and I'm going to be like, okay, I can think like that too. I think sometimes Paul is doing that, but it can become very frustrating at first if you're just trying to breeze through and trying to understand exactly what he's getting at. But Luke is different. In fact, those first 4 verses that I started off with presents the way he thinks. He's very orderly, and he thinks in sequence, and he captures things in precision order even. And let me just give a couple of examples. When Luke is writing about how Jesus sent out these disciples into villages, if you just slow down and read the details of what he tells them to do, you can see that he is recording an actual discipling and church planting strategy in which pairs are going to go out, they're going to set up houses of trust and authority, and then behind them Jesus is going to come in, and that will have this crescendoing effect of populating Galilee with the message of Christ in a multiplicative form. So Luke sort of captures community building ministry designs. Another thing that he does is he'll be talking about 2 people who are working together. In one case, it's Aquila and Priscilla, and then when it almost looks like they had a change of ministry rank in terms of the volume of work that they are going to put out. And Luke at that time changes the order of just the names. He does the same thing with Barnabas and Saul. Something happens, and Saul kind of comes into his own, and he takes on the name Paul, and they switch the order. Now it's Paul and Barnabas. It's just little things like that are not just accidental and incidental when you're reading and getting in touch with Luke's commitment to order. Another thing that you can do with Luke is you can identify when he was dropped off on the missionary journeys in order to sweep up and to follow through on church planting that Paul had done. And so Luke will be writing, we were traveling and we came to here, and then he will switch his language to no longer, and then we went to there. He'll switch his language to, and then they went to, and so that Luke got dropped off there. And if you follow even his pronouns, then you can see where Luke is dropped off and left behind to do follow-through work. And so you see that precision. And when you put Luke's precision and order and sequence, and you sync it at the right times with the writings of Paul and all his spinning plates and theological ideas and such, then you're able to understand both of them or either of them in, I think, a more accurate, a more true understanding sort of way. So that's why we're going to make a mashup of the writings of Luke and Paul. And so here's another big thing, and this kind of tells us how we're going to go through episode to episode, especially after we go through the book of Luke and we go into his sequel, which is the book of Acts. And really, we're not going to study Paul until we come to Acts, because Paul doesn't show up on the scene until the timeline of Acts. And so, again, Luke is a timeline of the account of Jesus' life and ministry, and then Acts is another timeline of the growth of the church. And so we're going to come to some point in the book of Acts where Saul, also Paul, the one who's going to do all these writings, becomes a Christian. And then he's going to become a mover and shaker, and we're going to follow his missionary journeys. And in Acts, we're going to go, according to Luke's writings, through the story of Paul going on his first missionary journey. And this is where it's going to get interesting. With all due respect, I'm going to stoke my stogie for this next part. This is the interesting part with the mashup of this series. But he's going to go on this first missionary journey, and he's going to come back. And again, we're reading Luke's text and timeline in the book of Acts, and this is the timeline, the time frame in which Paul writes his first letter. And we're going to stop reading Luke's writings, his sequential timeline in the book of Acts at that point. We're going to stop, we're going to pause, and we're going to go to, Paul wrote the book of Galatians here. And we're going to go read Galatians. And in reading it, we're going to do so with knowing the backstory. We're going to know where Paul is on his missionary journey. And so with that understanding, we're going to read Galatians. It's going to illuminate a lot of the stuff. He's like, why is Paul going on and on and on about this stuff in the book of Galatians? And now it's going to make sense. Before, you read Galatians and you loved it because it's just a powerful book. It's got urgency to it. It's got sharp words. It's got motivational things to read and to recite. But it's also crazy. I mean, he is hyped up about something, and we're going to know what it is that he is hyped up about. And that's where and what a great way to introduce, Paul too. Then, after reading this orderliness of Luke, it's in the book of Galatians. By the way, that Paul does an analogy. He does an analogy of an Old Testament truth. And you know how analogies, can get real complicated. And you're trying to understand, okay, what matches what. Well, he's doing an analogy, and then inside of his analogy, he does an analogy of the analogy. And then it looks like he does an analogy of the analogy, and it makes me think of the movie Inception, right? It's like he goes down to another level, he gets underneath it, and another level, and you're like, wait, what are we even talking about, anymore? And he's referencing this theological model that he came up with, or he's going to explain, in better detail in person later on, I don't know. But if we do have the backstory of why he's doing this, then it makes profound sense why he's going through all that. Okay, so anyhow, we're moving through Luke's timeline in Acts. He comes back from his first missionary journey. That's when Paul writes Galatians. We pause and we go study Galatians. So we come back to Luke's writing of Acts again, and Luke begins to describe the timeline. Now we're going into Paul's second missionary journey, and when Paul is done with the second missionary journey, then we're going to pause and we're going to read and study Paul's letters to the Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians and 1 Thessalonians. And that's a little teaser. We're going to do it in that order because I think Second Thessalonians, actually written before First Thessalonians. And then we're going to go back to Luke again, and we're going to read where Paul goes to his next place or his next missionary journey. And then at the appropriate places, we're going to stop, or we're going to read Romans, so we're going to read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then later on, towards the end of Luke's book, the book of Acts, we're going to see that Paul is going into his prison situation. And then we're going to pause before we get to the very end of the book, and we're going to read books like Philemon and Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, even Hebrews. We'll take a stab at that one. And then we go and we finish up the book of Acts, and then there's some more books after that too. But you can see how we're going to do the mashup. We're going to use Luke in the book of Luke and Acts as a timeline, very orderly sequence to establish the backstory. And then we're going to see a lot more backstory going. Paul's not just going to go off on tangents. He's also going to fill in lots of blanks to the continuing backstory. In fact, there's a whole drama story that we're going to go into in the study of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul is writing letters in some cases to churches and giving them this ongoing, in-depth mentoring guidance. And while he's doing that, he's dropping mention of all the things that they're wrapped up in. We're just going to get this up-close personal look at what is happening in actual congregations and in a community of congregations. And Luke and Paul are they're just begging us to do a mashup of the writings. So that's what we're going to do in this series. All right, so that's a mouthful of introduction, but I think all that stuff is really interesting. And if it's at least fun for me to sit back and rock in this chair and hear it creak and smoke a cigar while I think again about it. And I think there's some others that think that this would be interesting too. So let's return real quick so we can wrap it up on this episode to those first 4 verses that is episode number 1. Okay, and by the way, as we go through all of this, each time I'll give the next section of reading, study, commentary that we're going to be going through, so that if you're listening, you can read ahead and kind of hear the commentary, watch the commentary, and be prepped beforehand, have your own thoughts. And maybe you will even have some questions before I can get to some stuff, and they can be sent in to me, and I might be able to, address them. But Luke chapter 1, verses 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to read them again, just kind of talk through some of it. And again, this is Luke introducing this account of Jesus, the life of his ministry. And it starts off, it says, since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us. All right, I mean, just listen to that right there. Luke is saying that there were lots of other people who wrote accounts too. And he uses the word many and many times in the New Testament, including Luke's use of the word many. Many is many. Many times it's many. I think that there were lots of accounts. People were like, this is such good stuff. We got to write this stuff down. And you get the impression too as you're reading Paul and all of his writings of the New Testament. And we also are going to read in some places that Paul wrote more stuff that we just don't have. We don't have all of this stuff. Well, he also wrote all of this stuff in a relatively short period of time. He was always writing. And I think a lot of people were writing. But Luke is referencing that there were many others who also, they wrote an account of the things accomplished among us. And accomplished, among who? The missionary bands, I think, especially of Christianity. Luke was part of especially the missionary bands. And I think that the way he writes and the things he captures, he's trying to capture the missionary qualities of the early Christian church. And so since many others have done this, and then he goes on, he says, just as they were handed down, or those writings those stories were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so many of these folks are writers of this, and they're also the hander-downers of these other accounts of the accomplishment of Jesus' church, and they were eyewitnesses. They were the primary sources of what actually accomplished. They saw it for themselves. And they were also servants of the word. So these were insiders who got to actually participate in a believing and winsome, affirming sort of way of what they were doing. They were servants of the word. Therefore, in verse 3, he says, "It seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning." And so Luke gathered these sources, many of it eyewitnesses, involving servants of the word. There being multiple writings other than his. He went through an investigative process of those. He didn't just copy and paste, but he investigated everything thoroughly from its very beginning. And so he puts all those little specifics in there that he is a researcher. And one of the things we read in Paul's letters is that this is a doctor. He is a physician. He is someone who knows how to research. He is trained in skill. He's got technical and proficient abilities. He is organized, and we see the proof of it. And by the way, Luke he's writing a Greek, a form of Koine Greek, or a quality of Koine Greek, biblical Greek, the common people's Greek, that is better written. It's a higher, better quality than most of the rest of the New Testament. And one of the ways that shows up is that there are literally hundreds of words Greek words in the book of Luke that are nowhere else in the New Testament. There are other better forms of Koine Greek literature that we have that are outside the Bible, but there are hundreds of words that he uses. He's got a vocabulary that's more sophisticated than the average Joe. And so Luke, he says he's investigated everything from the beginning carefully to write it out for you in an orderly sequence. And I was looking at the Greek forms of the words he was choosing in here, and different translations will say sequence, and some will say chronological. But as an engineers, they understand sequencing, especially. They've got these sophisticated machines that they might put together. And there's different subsystems of a machine that need to be built almost on their own and together. And this system has to be built, alongside and parallel to this system being built, and they got to be tied in at certain times. And there's a process called sequencing. And you can actually see how Luke, his book, is not exactly chronological, scene to scene to scene, but what he does is he takes kind of a thematic idea and he puts all the pieces together of that thematic idea, but then that thematic idea is in a chronological sequence to the next theological idea. So he investigates everything carefully, and he sequences the account of Jesus. And why is he doing that? And I think when you look at it, you can really, in the book of Luke, his writings, you can see him capturing the discipling strategies that Jesus used. And even the discipling strategies and church planting growth of the apostles' work and developing the church and growing. A lot of folks will take this idea where Jesus says, you're going to be witnesses, in Jerusalem and Samaria and to the ends of the world. And they'll actually divide the book of Acts into those three parts. It's almost like he's showing the sequence in which the rollout of his story is going to be. But anyhow, he investigates everything carefully from the beginning, and he writes it, and he says, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus. Whoa, what's this right here? He names somebody, and it's like he's writing this account, or he's turning this account in, he's reporting it in to a guy named Theophilus. Now I gotta reset my cigar here. So who's this Theophilus guy? Literally means, loved by God. And there's some fun research you can do to find out all the different scholars' opinions about who Theophilus was. Some people think that Theophilus was not anybody in particular. It was a person that Luke made up. And maybe you are Theophilus. Maybe he intended that whoever's going to read this account, they are Theophilus. And he's assuring you, the reader, that the stuff that he is putting here has been sequenced. And he in sequencing the order of the things that were accomplished among us. And I'm going to do that so that you can look back on it and replicate it. If you decide to be a people building or community building person, you can follow the sequence and you can engineer it for yourself too. And you are the loved of God, reader. You are most excellent Theophilus. I am writing to you. Think about that. What if I am most excellent Theophilus? What if you are most excellent Theophilus? What if I've got buddies, Ryan and Andrew and John, who sometimes, we contact each other or we see each other after a long time and we say, yes, most excellent Theophilus. And we just, you are loved of God. And I think you are most excellently loved of God. What if we are all, the Theophilus? Some people think that maybe Theophilus is a particular kind of a reader Luke made up so that he could think of this personality as he was writing his chronicle, and that way he could just kind of have a point of reference to keep his writing style consistent. Theophilus may have been the underwriter of Luke doing all of his R&D, his research and development to put together a most excellent piece of work and history of the Christian church. And then folks wonder, well, then who might this, Theophilus actually, would he have shown up in some of the stories of the New Testament? Can we locate him? Was that his actual name, or was that a code name? And he didn't want him to get into trouble. First, maybe the guy was in a precarious position of great stature and official office, where if they knew that he was the underwriter, so he changed his name for purposes like that. One fun idea I have sometimes is, who else showed up in Luke's writings where there was kind of a weird mention of them, and it was kind of a cool encounter, but then you didn't really hear anything about what happened afterwards. And one example is there's this Ethiopian eunuch that Philip is he's outside of Jerusalem. There was a persecution that broke out and the church scattered out beyond Jerusalem, and Philip is walking along and there's this Ethiopian eunuch, and you're like, what's an Ethiopian? Yeah, that's another story some other time. But the Ethiopian eunuch is well-to-do. He's got a vehicle, right? He's on a chariot of some sort, and he's reading. And he's reading a scroll of Isaiah. And Philip comes up to him and he says, hey, what are you reading? He's like, I'm reading, this, but how am I going to understand unless someone explains it to me? And Philip, who knows Jesus, and he's filled with the Holy Spirit, and he was laid hands on by the 12 apostles, he begins to explain to this Ethiopian eunuch about Jesus' fulfillment of this Isaiah scroll that he's reading. And the Ethiopian at some point is like, I'm a believer. There's some water we just came up to. What's prevent me from being baptized? And the Ethiopian eunuch, well-to-do, goes into the water with Philip, gets baptized, and it's this powerful scene. He comes back out of the water, and Philip's not there anymore. And the Holy Spirit literally whisked him away to another place. I think it was Caesarea in Israel. And the Ethiopian eunuch is like, that's pretty par for the course. We're doing miracles here. And he goes off. And there's a lot of historical tradition that he went and he founded, a whole region of Christianity in Africa. And you don't hear anything about him anymore. But, what if guys like that of great significance had contact with the church and they were able, with their wealth, to underwrite, to go into a time of R&D and do all this research and author this stuff. And what if Luke is reporting, his account now to most excellent, Theophilus, the underwriter of his work. And that has to be the Ethiopian eunuch, but that's just an example of, maybe some guy like that out there. But he says, I intend to write it out for you in an orderly sequence, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things that you have been taught. So Theophilus he's already been taught these things, and he's going to put together the exact truth about those things. And maybe that's to bring him to a next level of understanding, then maybe it's to equip him to do some sort of community building, people building in his own area. Maybe there are people during the times of the writing of the book of Luke, they said, all right, we've come into a new age. The apostles are dying. The original guys are gone, and it's the next generation. We need the history of the things that have been accomplished to be investigated, to be ordered, for careful detailing to be made, for someone to be set aside to do the R&D, to compile that together and have it all sequenced so that we can look back on it then and identify strategies of us moving forward in a time that is different than the original. And so I think that there's a lot more loaded in here than you might first observe just by cursory reading of it. So this is the beginning of Luke. Now I think this is probably important too. Luke is a gospel. Usually when you think, what is the gospel? Well, it's the good news of Jesus, right? It's the thing that you believe in, to be saved. And, I would be curious as in one sentence, or even less than a sentence, in one phrase, without using good news, of what would you say the gospel is, right? And I would probably camp out on the idea it is the report that God sent his son. That's the most encapsulating, simple, brief expression. What? God has a son? Yeah, he's got a son. That was news to a lot of people. And here's a report. He sent him. He sent him. And the rest is details. I think that's the gospel. But what we're talking about here is a little bit different than that. This is a gospel book. This is a particular literary genre in the New Testament called a gospel. And we know that there are 4 gospel accounts, that 4 literary genres called a gospel. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a lot of debate over the centuries, people trying to pinpoint what makes a gospel, a literary genre, appropriately be a gospel. And I think there are 3 things. Number 1, and this is true about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are an account of the life of Jesus. Very simple. It's an account of the life of Jesus. And Matthew comes at it at one angle. Matthew, for example, has a beginning before Jesus is born, like Luke does, the one that we're reading. Matthew and Luke go before Jesus was born into some details. And Matthew has Jesus arriving on the scene, coming out of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, coming out of the Jewish history and the Old Testament law and the prophecies and the prophets, coming out into the New Covenant era. And he's coming from the Jewish history and by contrast, Luke is writing the account of Jesus, and Jesus is in many ways coming out of the bowels of the Roman Empire. In the midst of the Roman Empire, within the bowels of the Roman Empire, Jesus is coming forth. And there's the name of certain rulers and governors and people of great leadership and influence position that names the times of their reigns. And it keeps referencing, and you get this feeling that Jesus is coming from the bowels of the... and so it's an account of Jesus, but it's written in a certain a manner. And his account of Jesus is written a different one than Mark, than Luke, than John. Well, the second thing I think makes a gospel, and I think this is very important, is it's not just a straightforward book. It has a theological angle. Matthew has a theological angle. Mark does, Luke does, John does. And while all of them can be synced and they have accord with one another, they're consistent with one another, their theological angles they're different. They have a different theological purpose. And we can go into that more later in the future, but Luke, what really strikes me is the emphasis of the power and the presence of the Holy Spirit in people's lives, especially as they come to grips with the forgiveness of their sins. And there's there's something about the forgiveness of one, that's everything. That's the most powerful lightning bolt, in the world. That's what changes lives. That's the thing that reconciles people, humans to themselves and humans to one another. And there's a lot of movement in Luke's writings and also in Paul's, and it's because he's on missionary ventures, where different jealousies between different people groups are visited. The storyline goes from different kinds of people, different kinds of socioeconomic classes, from the high class to the low, and from this people group to this one. And the power in all of that is that the Holy Spirit is present and is forgiving people's sins. And they are loaded with this lightning power of reconciliation to life. And there's just this wonderful emphasis and motif of power and presence of the Spirit and forgiveness and reconciliation with people. That's the key. That right there's the key. And then the conflict that people have with one another and the test about whether they can reconcile with them or they can't. And instead they choose the way of jealousy and division. That's almost the test about whether they experience the real Spirit. And I just think that is a massive theological angle that Luke has. Yes, it's an agenda. The Gospels have an agenda. Sorry for those who want to say there is no agenda, it's just a straightforward book just telling us what happened. No, it has an agenda. The third element that a gospel is going to have is that the author has a literary agenda. And so the first one was a theological agenda, and that has a lot to do with the content. But the writer has a literary agenda also. And what I mean is that there's sort of an apostolic decision about the style, the choice of words, and the rhetoric used to write it in the first. There's a mood and an attitude in the writing of each of Matthew that's different than Mark, that's different than Luke, that's different than John. And So these writers are, if they're not apostles, they're apostle-sized figures. They're used to forming churches, forming strategic movements, impacting whole communities. When they write, they pull a lot of, or do anything, direct, they teach, exemplify, and they pull a lot of weight, a lot of influence. And they're trying, when they're writing these things, they're writing these things at key moments in history of the church. That's why they're writing this stuff. And they're not just relaying content, but in their writing, they're trying to instigate. They're trying to instigate moods. They're trying to instigate thoughts and decisions and caring about the material. They're trying to have an effect on the reader, not just with the content, but the rhetorical way that they're talking to the reader. And in Luke, I think his literary agenda is something I already mentioned. I think it has to do with the sequencing. He's trying to lay out something that can be replicated. He's like, if you read this, you're going to see that I've sequenced it, and your attention at some points is going to be like, he's telling us these geniuses did it this way, and there's insights in them that we can draw from and we can replicate. And as you read his style, his orderly fashion, and he assures us up front, investigated all that, then we're going to have a sense of the description here is maybe not necessarily command, we got to do it that way, but it certainly is something for us to go back and study to make our Christian faith a people-building enterprise, a faith community building. And that's one of the things that excites me about Luke's writings or his approach to writing this stuff. This is something we should look at in today's times where people building and community building, I think, is on the wane. It's lacking. And he captures that in his literary agenda and how he writes this. And that makes this a literary gospel. So here's the preview for the next episode. Is the reading will include Luke chapter 1, verse 5, and we'll take it all the way to chapter 4, verse 13. And obviously I'm not going to read that whole text next time, but what we're trying to do by going Luke chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 4, verse 13 is where we're going to spend next episode coming to the section is going to drive us to. And by the way, these sections that I've selected, they're not just, I would like to go to this point and then I'd like to go to this point. There's much study that has gone into the proper stages of the writer, and when he sat down to write can be identified. This is probably the stage. This is all these verses, these passages probably go together to a next stage of important information. And so what I've tried to do is identify the terrain, the next terrain feature or stage of thought that we might put all those verses together in order to get us to the next one. So we're driving in this next section really to chapter 4, verse 14, which will be the third episode. And that says, "And Jesus then returned to Galilee, and the power of the Spirit and news about him spread through all the surrounding region." So what we're going to talk through next episode is going to bring us to this idea that then Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. So what happens in episode 2 as we talk through it that brings him to Galilee in the power of the Spirit and news spreading throughout the region, and where he begins teaching in the synagogues and receiving praise from all who are around him. Well, the lead up to that is next episode. Okay, well, this was enjoyable, at least for me. I've got my drink, my stogie, my ambiance, my evening time, my review on the content that I enjoy. And I hope that some of my buddies plug in and this provokes some thoughts and questions, and they even give their own input and contact me. This is going to be fun going through. Hope that you can join me through all of this. I am going to make all of this make sense together. So if you're committed to listening through this podcast and spending some time on it, it's not just about the entertainment of what you do as a hobby in the evening. This is going to establish a scriptural literacy at a level that you haven't seen before. It's going to tie things together. You're going to get a sense of the basic framework and backbone of the entire New Testament. And after we tie in all of Luke's writings and all of Paul's writings, then what you'll have is a framework where you could add to it, and we'll do it on other series. Is, well, how does John tie in to that framework also? And so when we do a series on John, we'll be looking at the book of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation, and tying all of those together. In that series, you can plug in, as an attachment to this one. All right, feedback welcome, and catch you next time. Peace out.